online. David Carter joining us today. So David Carter, I'm delighted David's with us. David, the Coronacasts are kind of an organic thing. They're not a union thing. They're just something that happened back in March, because Dan and I were getting so many phone calls when schools were required to close in mid-March that we couldn't cope with them. So we decided to do a Zoom. It was a pretty ropey, poorly led Zoom if I reflect on it, but it's been then a mechanism we've used. We started then doing them daily to respond to questions over the first few weeks, and now we've gone into a pattern of doing them every Wednesday at 11 o'clock. So it's what the format is, that we go and get questions through the chat. Dan and I go and talk for a bit about things. Ray curates the chat and does an excellent job of that. But since January, we've been inviting in people that we really respect, and people that we'd really like to hear from, because it's talking about COVID for 12 months, it does get a little bit wearisome. So really pleased you're able to join us. I first came across your work when I came, when you were National Schools Commissioner, and I heard you speak at in Cheshire, and you said something really powerful to me, Dave, which stayed with me since. You were talking about your leadership journey and saying that you'd been at a successful school, and I know that Dan worked with you at John Cabot, so I also know a bit about that. But it was actually, you said you couldn't say you're a successful school or a really successful leader if schools around you were failing. Yeah. And I know you're one of the first pioneers in then becoming a school that looked beyond their own school gates and took over schools which were failing, and quite remarkable the journey that then happened. So I think that's what we are as leaders on this Coronacast. We have CEOs on the call. We have directors of education. We very much firmly believe in looking after schools beyond our own school gates. So I'm so pleased that you came here you're here today. I'm also pleased as well because you wrote an article in Schools Week which really resonated as well. And if you could touch on that at all, because we are feeling weary. We have put ourselves our schools first at some personal cost. So I just thought that was such a powerful piece of writing, and it'd be great if you could continue, with that vein, because I think not many people understand the pressures if they've not been in the job. And it was very clear from that Schools Week article how much you kind of tapped into how leaders are feeling at the moment. So welcome, David. You've got 10 minutes to go and talk to us, and then we'll get into Dan and I just talking about COVID. So thank you very much.
Simon, that's a really kind introduction, and I was delighted to get the invitation to take part today. I do care a hell of a lot about education, and I really care about the impact that I think there has been on the well-being and the health of leaders, and what I think will come in the future. I think what we're really good at doing as leaders is we tend to take care of everybody else and make sure that everybody else that we work with has got what they need, but we don't take enough time to think about what we need personally as well. And as I wrote in the article, I talked about the challenges that you face in headship, and I became a head in 1997. And I was in schools right the way through that period until 2014, when I went to become the Southwest RSC and then NSC, as you said. And throughout that period of time, I had my fair share of really difficult moments, exam results that I was really disappointed with, that I hadn't seen coming. 2 or 3 inspections where we had just bonkers inspection teams that I knew weren't listening. And all of that kind of really makes you reflect and think hard about your own experience. But the point I made in the article was that those challenges were spread out over 2 decades, whereas what you guys are dealing with today is something which has just been unprecedented in a 12, 13-month period of time. And I suppose what I'm spending a lot of my time doing now, my work basically falls into 3 categories, I suppose. I do the work that I do around school leadership development with Ambition Institute and with the MBA program that I teach on for the University of Buckingham, which I really enjoy doing that. And that's very much one of the things I wanted to do when I left the DFE, which is to put something back into the system and spend some time, I guess, going back to my roots and developing leaders and developing leadership capacity. The second element is working with multi-academy trusts, which is obviously something I do a lot of, helping them build their strategic plans. And then the third element of it is working with leadership teams, kind of semi-coaching, semi-mentoring, but also putting some challenge into their thinking about where they go next. And it's really through that work, I suppose, that I've seen really close up the challenge that the people are facing at the moment in terms of what the day-to-day issues are. And on one hand, I want to be forgiving of the government for saying that the goalposts keep changing so quickly, because actually I think we also have to recognize that no government's ever had to deal with this either. But then I'm also tempering that by the fact that actually some of the things that we knew about were predictable, and some of the debates around the exams, for example, just created such tension in schools, and we've underestimated, I mean, we haven't, but I think the government has underestimated what 16-year-olds and 18-year-olds have been going through after all those degrees of certainty that everything they were doing was going to lead to something called GCSEs, and then possibly something called A levels, and then a route into work or university. And actually, we've got children now sitting there in year 12 who haven't really had that experience for 2 years. And I think it's those kind of things that make it very difficult, because the resilience that we need is twofold. There's a resilience about how we cope professionally with this challenge, and how do we lead the return to more children coming back into school. That's a technical challenge at one level, but there's an emotional challenge, which is the multiplier effect of every conversation that we have with a young person or with an adult who feels what we do, but they only have the one conversation with us. We have it with lots of different people. And so for me, there's a real issue here about how we make sure that we take care of our cadre of leaders, that we continue to model the kind of ethical leadership, I suppose, about how we model to others in our teams who we want to succeed us in the future, that we reinforce that leadership is such a powerful position in the public sector. The leadership of schools has never been more important and more sharply into focus. And yet you see through social media still people attacking us and our colleagues for some of the things we do. Now, the debate that's very live at the moment is the guy who's the head of the junior school who has been vilified because he has some tattoos. This is not the time to even think about that. And how can you? It's one of the reasons, I guess, why I feel so strongly about the reinspection of schools. I mean, Ofsted's framework is based upon the typicality of a school day. It's about comparing nationally what is typical in the school sector, and we are just not in that place at the moment. And it just feels wrong that schools are being reinspected at the moment in that way. So we also need to, I think, maintain the higher moral ground here about what's right and what's ethical in the way that we approach it. But I suppose the thing that I was wanting to share most with you is kind of the thinking that I've been doing around, which was partly in the Schools Week article, but also about some of the work that I did in the book, which somebody was kind enough to mention a moment ago, but also in the work that I'm doing in leadership, which is when you think about what we need as school leaders, there are three things that help us to do our job really well. One is a degree of stability in the environment that we lead. So stability in terms of what do we understand is not going to shift. And on top of that firm foundation, what are the things, therefore, that we can bolt our strategies on top of? So I think it's really important for us to create maybe a new model of stability, recognizing that the world is going to be different. But just point of reference, I don't believe we're about to see a revolution in education. I don't think we're going to see the world turn upside down. I think schools will kind of look a bit like we thought they looked like 18 months ago when this settles. But I don't think we're on a quest either to go back to January last year, because things have happened and moved forward, and therefore we will start from a different position. So for me, the stability that we need to provide for our classroom teachers, for our middle leaders, and ourselves and our governing bodies is really important as we think about that new landscape. The second element of that is, I call it predictability. That's going to be a bit harder, I think, because at the moment, trying to predict the future is a bit like trying to guess the lottery numbers. Even though the Secretary of State's been on all the news outlets this morning talking about March the 8th, it's quite clear that he doesn't know the answer to some questions, particularly with regard to exams in the summer. And if he doesn't know the answer, then who does? So what exactly are we preparing children for when they come back into our classrooms in March? So that predictability is something that we need, because you need a fixed target when you're trying to improve your school. You need to know what good looks like when you've got there. At the moment, we have some uncertainty around that, but that predictability is the second. I guess the second layer, if you like, that you need to have in place when you're thinking about leading improvement in schools. And then the third one, I'll use that word typicality again, that I mentioned in the comment about Ofsted a moment ago. Typicality is kind of, if we're going to try to help people become better teachers, and for me, the only school intervention strategy I've seen that works is quality first teaching. Everything else is an intervention around that. If we're not relentlessly focused upon the quality of teaching and the quality of the classroom experience for young people, then anything else for me is just a periphery to that. But that level of typicality means that our classroom teachers need to understand what a typical experience for a child might look like. And that's the other thing we're going to have to wrestle with. And I don't think you can mandate that from central government. I don't think you can mandate the typical school experience from anywhere other than our school settings. So one of the things that our leaders are good at and are going to need to be good at for the next 12, 18, maybe even 24 months is reconceptualizing what a typical school experience day looks like as we go forward. And then I'll try to bring it full circle if I can. I mean, Simon was kind enough to talk about, my view, which I've said many times about, I cannot be happy that the school I'm leading is successful if schools elsewhere in the town or the city that I work are unsuccessful. And I've always felt a strong moral obligation to help, and in my career, I was lucky, I suppose, that the things like the advent of NLE status, teaching schools, the multi-academy trust model came along at the time where I was able to create it. I could use that structure to enable me to not just talk about helping others, but do something practical around that. And I was always driven by the idea that I remember, this is very stark, it's going back a bit, but I remember in a secondary heads meeting in Gloucestershire, which is my first headship was, that one of the heads stood up and talked about a school in Gloucester that had gone into special measures. And with great glee, he talked about the fact he'd been able to headhunt, he called it, the head of maths from that special measure school, because why would they want to work in a special measure school when they could work for him? And he did the same thing with kids. And I just thought that was just, well, I thought it was abhorrent, quite frankly, but it was morally very dodgy. And actually what you needed to see in those situations is that when a school gets into difficulties, everybody else in that community puts the wagons in a circle and helps it out. And I've always been driven, I think, by that. And I think this is going to be a mindset that we're going to need more than ever right now, because I don't think any school has got the answer to these problems. I don't think any school can say they've got the monopoly of challenge. And I don't think anybody says they've got the capacity to deal with this on their own. So one of the reasons why I'm so happy to support this today and podcasts around the country like this is that we need to work together. We need to share our thinking. We need to share our worries. We need to spread the anxiety a little bit beyond our own classrooms and our own offices and our own schools to make sure that we're sharing it. Because if you had the time to sit down and get 20 case studies of what people are thinking this morning, you'd end up with 2 or 3 very common factors. There wouldn't be 25 different things. And so for me, this ability for us to open ourselves up both to our successes and our failures, for me, is going to be one of the things that will underpin leadership going forward. And the idea of being an isolated school leader, I hope, will be a thing of the past. And hoping it is one thing, doing something about it is quite different. But we won't get there unless if we drive ourselves back into the shadows, and that we do stand up and we challenge authority respectfully. We talk truth to power. We have those conversations with Ofsted. We have our conversations with the DFE and RSC, and we engage in those kind of consultations, which sometimes feel a little bit tenuous. But we can't complain, I suppose, when the DFE does something bonkers if we haven't told them that it's bonkers. So I feel very, very confident in the way that what we're seeing here is an unleashing of the voice of school leaders. And the more that we do that, not just in the current climate, but in 5-10 years' time, we'll change the landscape, I think, through having a different dialogue with power. And if number 10 is serious about levelling up, or whatever phrase the Prime Minister chooses to latch onto, he can't do it without us. And he certainly can't do it to us. So I think this is a really interesting period of time that we're about to embark on. So Simon, I hope that's helpful in sharing a few thoughts.
Really helpful. I just want to pick up on 2 points, David. I mean, we know about the DFE, but I am encouraged very much with the appointment of Sir Kevin Collins to look at over catch-up, and he's promised to engage with the profession. We will invite him onto a Coronacast because I've done some work with Kevin in the past. So this notion of catch-up being a longer-term thing than a 2-week summer school is really encouraging. I know, Sir Kevin, you will have worked with him, David, in your role.
Yeah, he's a top appointment into that role. Yeah. I mean, I can't think of anybody better. And the work that he did at the Education Endowment Foundation was significant. But I think the other thing he said, which I think is really helpful, is he's also talked about the value of kids being outdoors, the arts, sport, not just more English and maths. I think if it's more English and maths from 4 till 6, we're going to do more damage to kids if we're not careful than we are help. So this has to be about thinking about how we engage kids back into the classroom setting and the school environment, and we have to take, I think, a very creative view of that.
And as an ex-music teacher, I'm sure that was
Oh yeah,
music to your ears, to have a pun.
all day long.
And circling the wagons, really interesting. I know Lee, actually, the head teacher in question, because he's a fellow Stokey. He's only been ahead just over 12 months. So I was in contact with him today, and I've been offering him support through our press office at the NHT. And he does join in with the Chronocast, but he's got a budget meeting this morning, so he's okay. But I have been warned by that, the way that everybody has just put their arm around him. I've had a couple of things which have hit national media, and it was the same for me, really, the way my colleagues and my school community, most importantly my governors and my parents, and Lee's getting exactly the same. His parents are really supportive of him, his governors are there, and I think the profession, the way they've, the statement from Alison Peacock yesterday was really encouraging. So Lee wants to say thank you to everybody, because he's normally on the Chronocasts, and I'm sure your words will resonate with him, because I said I'll send a copy of our meeting today. So David, really great to hear your wise words. I mean, it's the work you continue to do. I know Dan talks about your MBA program. I know a number of colleagues are on that program. You continue to be a system leader, and one of our most influential system leaders. And I think that's a credit to our profession. We've got somebody like you still championing teachers and teaching. Okay, so we're going to go on to the Chronocast business now. So just want to talk about the return on the 8th of March. So we've had notice. I've said on the Chronocast before that to expect and plan for an 8th of March return for schools, especially primary schools. I did expect secondaries to be more staggered, because Sage had recommended that on the 28th of January meeting. However, our secondary colleagues, I spoke to our ASCL rep from Cheshire yesterday, met with him. He's got 1,700 children to test in the first week twice. So the logistical challenge of that is amazing, but there is some flexibility for secondary schools to actually have that staged approach. But Lee was optimistic. He was looking forward to having the children back. But of course, that's a real challenge. So if we can help our secondary colleagues, this is predominantly a primary forum and special school forum. I know we don't have too many secondaries joining in, but if we can help them in any way on that first week back, or just ask them if they need any, just offer some support. It's because it's going to be a really hard challenge to get all those tests done after that. In terms of the 8th, I think it's in terms of primary schools. Clearly, the numbers are looking good, and I was really encouraged by Chris Whitty's comments on Monday. Dan, we had a chat after that, didn't we? Because in terms of the safety coming back, and he was asked that question, wasn't he, by I think it was a journalist in the Daily Mail.
Yeah, I think he was very clear in the press conference that he wasn't in agreement with what was written in the press, how he didn't agree with the opening of schools. But I think what was really reassuring was it's one place where the scientists are all agreeing, is that universally the best place for children is in the classroom. And I think we haven't had through this crisis a unified scientific view. And I think if that's the unified view, then we should be really encouraged by that. And
I think as an educationalist, Dan, I'm delighted that schools are coming back. My parents are delighted, my staff are delighted, and really looking forward to having children come back. And that's all we can. Whether the timing's right, that's a political decision, and it's really hard for us to go and comment on that. It would be a real shame if we had to close schools for a third time. It would be, it wouldn't just be a shame; it'd be absolutely heartbreaking. So hopefully they've got it right.
I think we can't downplay the impact this has had on parents and how they really need the children back in school. I think we all agree with that.
I'm also getting, we've also got things around what is it safe. Now, we've never been able to say it's safe. What we're saying is we're doing all that we can to reduce and manage risks for our school communities. So I think it's really important when we hear the Secretary of State in December saying, schools are incredibly safe. I think that's disingenuous, because none of the medical officers and science saying that. Schools, there is spread in schools. There is spread from children to children. There is spread. However, there's but the balance is that we need to be open so we can educate our children, because the impact is significant. So I'm quite confident that some of the measures we put in place will hold us well, because many of the schools here are primary schools. They've had minimal disruption around closure of bubbles, but there have been some singular cases and cases where schools have had to close in the primary sector and the secondary sector within Cheshire. So we just need to continue with those measures. So in terms of reopening, what you need to do, which I'm sure you know, but first thing you need to do is to look at the guidance, which was actually published at the same time as the Prime Minister made his announcement. So that was another great thing. We weren't waiting for a few days. So the appointment of Sir Kevin Collins and guidance landing at the right time, we could be entering a new era of good work coming our way. So we need to read that. There's hardly any changes for primary school. The changes are around wearing of face coverings for secondary schools and the testing for secondary schools. So, but look at any changes you've made, any enhanced measures. I know that we closed our staff room in January because we recognise that as a place where transmission could happen, and we also purchased those blue medical masks for staff based on the advice we had from Dr. Matt Butler at a Coronacast a few weeks ago. So they're the main things we've done as a school community, but you've really got to re-emphasise and revisit that risk assessment with your teachers and with your school community, because it's really important that the parents understand we're not through this. If we can really behave ourselves in the next 5 weeks, schools will stay open, and then we can start looking forward to the rule of 6 coming back as well. So engage with the communities, tell them how important it is that they follow those rules around dropping kids off, around not having children around for sleepovers. Because as David said earlier, we have a massive influence on our school communities, and we're in a privileged position where the parents listen to us. And so we can really help with that public health message, is if we want schools to stay open, we've still got to be really strict at following the rules. So then once you're doing your risk assessment, share it with staff. I'm sharing it with mine tonight at staff meeting, and then ask if they've got any comments they want to make. Is there anything else you can do as a school to make the school safer? And then ask them to make comments on it. Because if you consult with your staff and you've done everything that you possibly can to make schools as safe as they can be, it should stop the staff feeling they want to put in a Section 44 letter, which I know was a concern when we opened on January the 4th, with some schools not being able to open on January the 4th because of the volume of Section 44 letters they had through. I'm not quite sure nationally, because I've not spoken to Kevin and Mary. I've got a national exec tonight. I'm not quite sure what the mood music's like around the NEU, but I know locally our NEU reps weren't talking about Section 44 at all, but I'll find out a bit more about that because we've got an emergency national exec meeting on the NHT this evening. But let's work with them. You know, we've got great relations of working with the unions across the Northwest, but please go and talk to them. But if you consult your staff, see if you can make additional changes, then hopefully it will lead to staff feeling as confident as they can be, but also recognise their anxiety. Only a few of our staff have been vaccinated so far, so recognise they will feel anxious, but talk about, you know, the reason we closed schools in January the 4th was to reduce community transmission. It wasn't because schools were inherently unsafe. So talk about that. You know, it was a public health reason why we closed or why we reduced numbers. And also the fact that we've been having more children in. 25% of primary school children have been coming in. I've had classes of up to 20 coming in, and we've had no outbreaks over the last 8 weeks or so. So it does show that you can put in those protective measures and hopefully not get the spread. Big thing, of course, is making sure that staff and children don't come into school if they're having symptoms. And also making sure that if they have the lateral flow test and they get a negative outcome, they don't see that as a green light for relaxing. And that's for staff who are being tested and secondary school pupils, because you've got to act like you've got it, even if the lateral flow test says not. Okay. Dan, do you want to say anything about teacher vaccinations?
Well, we've had a lot of comments around prioritising teachers and school staff around vaccinations, but I think the real message from Chris Whitty was around reducing deaths, and I think that you know, there's been a lot of targeted people who are getting vaccines who do work in our schools, but I think it's probably right to follow that plan. It would be my view.
It's a really difficult one because it sounds logical, doesn't it? My window cleaner's been cleaning my windows this morning. We've had a chat through the window, and he says, "Why haven't they vaccinated teachers?" And I was like, "Well," and I was all for vaccine. You know, that was one of the things I was campaigning for back in December. But when we met with Matt Butler, and he said, "Well, actually, the priority list one is about reducing deaths, simply because if we actually get everybody vaccinated on priority list one, we'll reduce 98% of deaths." Then that really does say, well, perhaps we shouldn't be top of the list. However, I am seeing my staff being vaccinated. I heard a really interesting idea the other day, actually, from the CEO of ARC, who was on Radio 4 with Paul Whiteman, who talked about an age premium for frontline staff. So a 20-year age premium. So if you're 44, you'd go up the list, or if you were 24, you'd go up there. So that was interesting. But it's got to be for all frontline workers as well, not just teachers. If we are going to get some priorities around the profession or different public-facing people being vaccinated, we can't just say it's just teachers. We've got to talk about shop workers who are public-facing. We've got to talk about the police, the firefighters. We can't just say teachers are a special case, because the data that's come out of the ONS is that schools aren't a particularly high-risk environments. Places like taxis are, places like food factories are, places like your canteen, where you're preparing school meals. That's a high-risk environment. But actually, it sounds counterintuitive, but having 30 children in a class with a teacher with good with people taking preventative measures, it's not a high risk environment compared to some others. So I don't now agree that we should have a blanket vaccination of teachers, but I think there's some interesting ways that we can talk to government about that. I know NHT are working on that. Okay, want to talk about catch up as well. Oh, before I do that, Dan. So Dan, in terms of going back to school, in terms of re-emphasising the learning that we've done since March, what are you really going to make sure you're doing so that you can hopefully open your 5 schools with minimal disruption?
I think the key one for us is making sure that the adults, whether they're parents, whether they're school staff, whether they're visitors, are all following those rules. I've received a couple of complaints from parents across the trust that other parents aren't behaving themselves when they're waiting for the school gates to open, that parents will try and congregate. And I think that clear messaging out to communities that actually this is about keeping schools open, because if that, like we heard from Matt Butler a few weeks ago, really what's happening in the community is reflected in the school population. So if we get spread amongst parents because they're not following the rules, so clear communication around that is going to be our priority. Our risk assessments have been pretty static, I'll be honest, around that, but really just making sure that everybody follows those rules clearly and it's communicated out properly.
Yeah, and I think I'd like to really push on as well as ventilation, Dan, because especially the impact ventilation like they do in Germany, I think it's called Stoßlüften, where you go and air the classroom for every 5 minutes in the hour. And if you're a year 6 teacher, you can usually smell the stale air with your nose. So, but make sure you've got that clean air coming in. Doing that, that's the one thing I really want to almost put in bold in my risk assessment that's going to be shared with staff tonight. So, and also parent comms, Dan, because I've learned a lot during the Coronacast, and I've realised that quite a few parents don't read my newsletters, and I think they're great. I don't know why they don't read them, but we've got into a culture of doing a weekly Zoom lesson. I've had up to 300 parents on that, and actually parents, some of our parents like to be communicated via Facebook. Some of them like a text. And some of them, and many of them, like this Zoom culture we have now. It's only 20 minutes to half an hour, but if we can actually get our parents, like Dan says, behaving well outside of school, schools are still a mirror of what's happening in the local community. And if community transmission rates are low outside of school, schools will be able to open safely. And nobody's ever convinced me that that's the science behind that is really, really sound. So get your parents on board. Really appeal to their better nature. Say we've got 5 weeks now to be really good outside of school, and then we'll be able to have people in our garden. And then campsites are opening on the 12th of April, and the route to reopening is really encouraging, but it's not going to happen if people just start taking the foot off the gas over the next 5 weeks. Catch up was the final thing that landed this morning. Spoke to Channel 5 News about it just, so I had to quickly get around it. Don't know too much about the detail, but in monetary terms, Gavin Williamson said £6,000 for primary schools on average and £22,000 per secondary school. I've worked that out at about £25 per head, but there's also the talk about children in year 6 getting some extra support over the summer holidays, talking about a 2-week summer school. I think we need to make sure we don't overpromise to parents. Parents would say they would have a massive summer of catch-up back in 2020. That didn't happen. So, and I think what David said, it's about all those things that children have missed out on. Those children who used to playing an orchestra once a week, we want to make sure they can do that again. And actually ask them to stay after school and miss their football practice for some extra maths and English isn't going to be the answer. I think what David said about quality first teaching, that's the best intervention. If you want children to catch up, we need to make sure they've got the best quality teaching going on in the core school hours and the core school day. And we need to target the children who need it. And it might not be your typical vulnerable child. It might be a child who's, for example, I've got one of my best friends. His son's a swimming champion, and he gets up and he's swimming in the pool from 5 a.m. every morning and training, and he's the best in his age for butterfly in the country. His mental health has suffered significantly. Comes from a very affluent background, but his mental health has suffered significantly. And if he's asked to go and stay behind after school and miss his sport, he's going to be absolutely bereft. So think wider than just the children, because we've done a much better job in lockdown 3 in primary schools of getting those vulnerable kids in. Nearly all our vulnerable children have been in since January, but think about the children whose parents have been home working, who've not been able to give the children much time because of their demands of their job. Really think creatively about how you use it, and don't just be guided into a narrative that maths and English is where this should be. Okay, so I think that's all I need to say. We've got 10 minutes for questions, Ray.
Simon, can I just bring Andy Mellor in? He's got a wellbeing support webinar he just wants to mention, if that's okay.
Of course you can. Andy, welcome, and always good to see you. Andy Mellor, member of the NHG exec, Blackpool head teacher and ex-NHG president, and a dear friend. Andy, welcome.
Cheers, Simon. Thanks, Dan. And I just wanted to highlight something I've just put in the chat. There's a link to an NEHT Wellness and Protect webinar tomorrow, which is a free webinar. It starts at 10 and it's actually running all day, but I'm going to do a presentation about 3/4 of an hour about recovery. And within all of that, there's going to be some really useful tools and pointers in terms of just measuring how the children are presenting when they come back in, that hopefully will help your staff to be able to look at some of the basic Maslow stuff, I guess, in terms of how they're reacting when they come back into school and how you might build a recovery plan for them. Because my philosophy has always been that we need to build that recovery, that well-being recovery, if we're to make the most of the catch-up work, the money that Simon's just been talking about. So hopefully that'll be useful. We've got about 250 people on the webinar tomorrow, but please do dial in. I say the link is in the chat, and it's also advertised on Twitter as well. So thanks for that, Simon. Cheers, Dan.
Thanks, Andy. And another thing we shared at the last Coronacast with Rob Pullen, went and shared also the kind of trauma-informed stuff that Cheshire West have been doing. So do seek that out, or go and ask Susan to share that with you as well. I think Rob shared a toolkit, didn't he, with us last time? Okay, let's crack on with questions. Ray, how are we doing for questions?
Well, I'm just going to start by an observation, which is one of the most important things we can do at this time is to communicate. And David was talking about our role in communicating that now is not the time to take our foot off the gas, or you've said that. So this role about having this constant message to reassure staff, reassure community, and reassure children is probably the most important thing we can do at this time, alongside our risk assessment. And Steve Ellis has correctly put, it's right that we open schools, or it's my view that he is right, it's right that we open schools. But as leaders, we need to be able to back that up by some of the data that Chris Whitty has shared. He's talking about the R number. We do need to do everything that we can to ensure that the hospitals are not overwhelmed. But I think it's important for our staff coming back to hear this consistent message that it is right for children to come back to school, to put in everything that you need in the risk assessment. And the other thing I want to say is this point around transition is what everybody has to think about. So transition happens in moments of change. So making sure that we think about transition for the children that are nervous about coming back. Some children will be excited, some staff will be excited, some staff will be very anxious. So thinking that this is a moment of transition will help us to think about what provision needs to be put in place. So I'm going to tell you that I'm going to be putting, and this is a small thing I've thought about, everybody will have some ideas. I've asked my PTA this morning to put some balloons on the gates for when the children come back, as a sense of reassurance that everything is safe, as safe as it can be, but that people feel that sense of Maslow, that we've got them. It's our community job to make people feel held and secure.
Yeah, and I think the comment that Steve made is, can you turn your, I'm echoing, you know, it is right that children come back to school, Steve. I mean, if the timing's right, we'll wait and see, especially around secondaries, but you know, what we really don't want is to have a third lockdown in schools. So that's why we need to be ultra vigilant in terms of the safety measures that we could put in place. Okay, Ray, how are we doing questions?
Yeah, so question from Tam. We touched on this a little bit. Tam Bennett was served Section 44 letters by all of her staff, so they've only been open for key worker and vulnerable children since January. Any word on what the unions will encourage staff again? And I know you've just said that there's going to be a meeting of the unions this evening.
Well, no, we've got an NHT meeting this morning, this evening, national exec. So I should get a steer from Paul about what the other unions are thinking. So again, the Section 44 letters. I mean, the issue last time was the NEU met on the Sunday with members, and then Section 44 letters landed on Sunday afternoon. I mean, I've said to and I've said directly to Paul Whiteman, and that's totally unacceptable. The heads were getting emails, and I've said to the NEU, I said it on the Coronacast when we met in January, totally unacceptable. The heads were getting emails on Sunday afternoon saying staff weren't coming in. If you follow those steps that I talked about amending your risk assessment or just reissuing your risk assessment, asking staff for input into it about how you can make it even safer, and then responding to their input, I can't see how a Section 44 letter would be valid, because you can't just say, I don't feel safe. If you're putting in a Section 44 letter, you've got to say why I don't feel safe. And if you say why you don't feel safe, you then got to say what the school can do about it. So the leaders like us get an opportunity to do that. So Tam, I really hope you don't get the same thing, but I think start now by making sure you do the adjustments in your risk assessment, to do everything that you can with the SLT, get that out to staff and ask for their feedback, because just saying I'm not coming into school tomorrow because I don't feel safe isn't good enough. And actually,
can I come in there, Simon, as well?
Go on, then.
The template letters that were produced last time aren't really an acceptable letter to do this. It needs to be a personal letter rather than just a template letter. So what we've asked everybody, if we do get any, if they are template letters, then actually to reject them and ask for what you just said, specific reasons why you don't feel safe and what we can do about it. Because after that, it's really an anxiety issue that we need to be addressing around. And
if staff are that anxious, Dan, that they can't come to work because of their anxiety levels, then it's somebody needs to go to see a doctor, don't they?
It's a medical
issue. That's it, because I get people are incredibly anxious. I get it.
You also have to, they also have the right to ask for a personalised risk assessment. So when people have been saying that they feel anxious, we say, right, we're going to do a personalised risk assessment, especially for you, which is, if you like, on top of, it's enhanced from what you've got on your basic risk assessment. And so you just look at what additional mitigation steps you can put in, such as additional screens or bigger classroom or whatever. So that for me becomes the interim step.
But you can't write 44 individual risk assessments on a Sunday afternoon before you open the Monday.
No, you can't.
So it's about staffing.
These are the one or two.
These are people who are
anxious.
Yeah, absolutely. It should.
So to the other end of the spectrum, Sue Davis McCoy has said, with the new shielding list coming through, I have a staff member who's been asked to shield but doesn't want to. Any guidance from HR is saying they must shield. Claire Fletcher gave some really interesting input, which is why it's great to see the conversation on the chat. Advice is that, and this was advice from a briefing by Stone King lawyers, is that the government guidance needs to trump the GP advice. The last time this happened for me, the insurance for the insurance wouldn't have covered at a personal level for the staff member to come in, even if they'd wanted to. So I think it's a tricky one.
Yeah, sadly, it's really hard, this one. Ray, we're nearly out of time. I think we should do an extra 10 minutes today. Dan and Ray, are you happy to do
that's fine.
10 minutes? So yeah, I've had this in my school, but the advice is if that person then goes and catches COVID and dies, then where's the liability sit? And if your HR have advised you, normally if your local authority school, liability sits around those sort of things, around the local authority. And sorry, just getting a phone call from Stephen. Oh gosh, what's going on? Can you still hear me, Dan?
Yeah, I can still hear you.
Just had a phone call from. So yes, sadly, I had a member staff desperately wants to come into work. Clinic's extremely vulnerable. One of my cleaners, she's now been vaccinated and still wants to come into work, but she can't because actually, if she catches COVID, even though she had the vaccination and dies, then I've been advised by not to have her in. So sadly, no, I would advise not to have them back in.
We've had to have conversations with people in the same situation where we've had to talk about medical suspension. Because they were desperate to come into school, but actually insurance won't cover it. I'm not having that on my conscience. So
no, absolutely. Okay, next, Ray.
Can NAHT support or ask Ofsted not to visit for the next 2 weeks? A feeling of an impending sense of doom is something that Catherine is facing at the moment.
So is this a double RI school? I mean, what might be helpful actually, because I'm a trustee at Dan's school and they had Ofsted in yesterday, and Joe's on the call today. And Joe, I mean, Joe went and, when we had the phone call on Monday that they were coming in, your heart sinks into, even as a trustee I was only talking to Ofsted for an hour, but you just think, oh gosh, I wish they weren't. However, I've got to say the team were, and the words, and I've written to Sean Hartford to report this, the team were, what was the word I used, Dan? I shared it with you this just now. They were
compassionate and rigorous.
Yeah, and they were great actually. And Joe now feels 6 foot tall. Joe, do you want to just say anything about that, Joe?
I'm feeling the hope. I'm feeling the hope, Ray. It was supportive. I think we'd done a lot of work anyway. So
if you had the time, if you could have cancelled them now, if you could cancel them not coming in or say that they should come in, what would you do with the benefit of hindsight?
In hindsight, at 9 o'clock on Monday, it was the last thing I needed. Now I'm really, really pleased it happened.
Yeah. And it's really helped Joe and the team. It's given them a real boost because, when you double all right, it feels pretty crappy, doesn't it? It really does. But actually, it's given them a real boost about the work they've done. So, Kathy, please get in touch with Joe because you can share the experience of the day. I'm glad they came in. As a trustee of the school, I'm really glad they came in. I know Dan as the CEO is. So, I probably won't talk to Ofsted NHT about that, to be honest, because of the way that it was conducted. But of course, if you get a team that aren't behaving like that, please get in touch.
Joe, can I ask, how much, Joe, how much did they spend talking about COVID and what you'd done through this time, and how much were they focusing on other things about your plans for the future?
So the phone call on the Monday was very much how have we been hit, what percentage of children have missed school, what percentage of staff, and then the full day was more about what have we done since the last inspection. And our last inspection was March 2020, a week before we went into the first lockdown. So we had to show what we'd done through the entire period of lockdown, but it went very well. So it was very much on that and on our remote learning offer. So quite heavily on our remote learning offer.
So Joe, do you mind getting in touch with Kathy? Is it Kathy Kathy in Northwich that put that in the chat? Kathy Lord. Was it Kathy?
She's going to send me a direct message, Simon.
That's great.
So can I just say it's also worth noting that the current Section 8s have moved from 2 day to 1 day. And so it's 2 HMIs for 1 day rather than 2 days with 2 HMIs, which I certainly found when we spoke to them they were very focused, but absolutely knowledgeable and knew what they were talking about. So it was
yeah. And if that person, if they can DM me as well, that would be helpful. Okay.
As ever, Robertson makes a really valid point. So this is a comment really more than a question. Wish everyone would stop using the term catch up. It is psychologically damaging for children and also completely devalues what all of our staff have been doing through remote learning and supporting key workers. So I agree that if there is a better way, Joanna's clapping that as well. I think if there was a way of finding something that wasn't this deficit model, I think we'd all really love to hear
So
that.
if anybody can suggest that, Ray, another one, that'd be fab, because unfortunately we use it. I've been on the news this morning talking about it, and we use it because it's generally understood by the public. But what you're saying is bang on, bang on. It's a rubbish phrase, and we need to. But equally, I don't think recovery doesn't feel right neither. So think of something creative, Chronocasters, and we will try and change the narrative. Ray, I saw something on the chat about is it mandatory for staff to have to do the lateral flow tests? Absolutely no, it's not mandatory. So that's an easy one.
And I think it is.
You've just muted yourself, Ray.
It is an easy one, but I think it's really important that head teachers make sure they've communicated that, because the last thing that you want is for a member of staff to find out that it was optional and feel that the head teacher hadn't told them. So it's really important, that bit of messaging. It is a should and not a must. Or should. It is a could, but definitely not a must. So the next question is from Eldersley.
Sound's gone, Ray.
Again.
You need those. Where those headphones you got for your radio show?
I know.
I can hear my voice coming back. You've got your audio fail here, Ray.
Terrible. Can you hear me now?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Yeah. So Eldersley is asking, when can primary schools realistically think about not having bubbles? When do you think it will be a time when we'll be returning to whole school activities, collective worship, lunch in the dinner halls, etc.? I realise it's going to be phased in, but do we think it will be in September? For me,
do you want me honest?
I'll say, for me, I think it's just too early to say at this time.
Yeah,
I think this is like where we were a year ago. We've just got to follow the science, because even though that roadmap has been set out, anything could change. But my view is this is going on in these bubbles. The plan that we've got is like it was in September. I've gone back to my letter that I sent out to parents, and where I put the word September, I'm swapping it in with the word March, because it's so similar, with the exceptions of masks in classrooms, lateral flow testing, a bit more on ventilation, but it's pretty much the same thing, and it will continue for the foreseeable future until we know better.
Yeah, my honest answer, I'm afraid, is I can't see us having schools back to as they were until spring 2022, because Chris Whitty was talking about maybe having to wear face coverings next winter as well. And actually, it's about children transmitting it. Children might not be at high risk of it, but if they keep transmitting it, it could mutate. So, and there will be a vaccination program for children, we think, but they haven't done any testing around that. But as long as children can transmit it and the virus can mutate with children's transmission, then we are going to be in this for the long term, I'm afraid. So my best answer, and we can ask Matt when he comes on again, but my view is spring 2022 is so psychologically, but having schools back, we're going to be able to do more things, things like residentials will come back on the cards. We're not going to be quite as restrictive as we have been. There'll be a few gentle changes that we can do, but we're not going to be in a place, I don't think, until spring.
And I think helping people to cope with change is about priming people's brains. So messaging to staff also needs to include. So I'm glad that this question has been asked, because our staff need to know. A member of staff said to the Senko, she said, I can't believe it. She said, I cannot believe we're going to have 30 children in our classes in 2 weeks' time. And the Senko had to say, that's what we had in December. So people can get very lost. We've been doing this for a year. When the mental faculties get taken over, we're in survival mode. Everybody's on adrenaline and cortisol. People can't think straight. So the role of a leader is to find that oxytocin so they can slow people down, to make them feel really secure that it's going on for a little bit of time. We will be opening up dinner halls. We will be having a return, but it won't be immediately. And so
Ray, how are we doing? Because I'm aware that it's
my next question,
because we've got it's now 10 to.
Yeah, next question nurseries. I'm just might ask Sarah to come in on this, Sarah Gill or Jill to come in on this. She says, are schools with nurseries allowing children to attend their school nursery and other private settings over the course of the week? Or so I don't know if Sarah wants to come in. I don't have a nursery provision on my site, so I'm not sure I've got this question properly articulated.
Sorry, yes, that's right. I just wanted to know, given we were in a lockdown, I put in my risk assessment that we were trying to mitigate the risk, and I can't find any guidance.
Yeah, I'll cover that, Sarah. So I've got a nursery in our school, or we've got a nursery in our school, and we were allowing them to attend different, and we will continue to allow them to attend different settings. However, some of the private nurseries or childminders were blocking that, and because I don't offer holiday care, I'm only a 40-week-a-year nursery. Then it was, but I felt that it was safe enough to take additional steps and to allow them to attend two settings, but I was often stopped doing that because of the rules that they had. So it's an individual's choice, basically, what you choose to do.
Thank you.
Okay, very last one from me, and it's a quick one. So there's some comments here about vaccination and a suggestion to call your GP to see if there's any additional vaccines that are left over. That was one suggestion. Then there's been some comments about a website that has unfortunately been inundated with people phoning in to ask about vaccines. So I think I have to believe that behind this there is a process, and I don't know whether phoning in is going to overwhelm the system, but I'm not an expert.
Yeah, it's going remarkably well, the vaccines are. So let's do it. Anyway, it is 10 to. We've gone over 10 minutes. I'm a stickler for time, so I'm sorry for going over 10 minutes, everybody. Final word, I want to say big shout out to Lee Hill. Lee does join us on it. He's a fellow Coronacaster. He's had a really tough week, but he knows we've got to lose support. So Lee, good shout out, and we'll send this on recording for you. And also to Louise, who's done an amazing job with her walking 100 miles. Last time I looked, she'd raised over £5,000 in her walk there. So Louise, well done. I'll log in and see how you're doing, but you've done a remarkable job, and we'll probably hear from you next week about how it's been and where you're up to as well. Okay, thanks everybody. Sorry for going over time, but I think it's important we spent a bit longer today. I'll see you next week.
Bye everybody. Thanks everyone.